Hey everybody, and welcome back to another F1 Roundup brought to you by the Seedstream app. More on them in a moment. In this week's video, of course, I'm going to be talking about the emotionally charged radio communications, both at McLaren and Red Bull in the closing stages of the Hungarian Grand Prix, and what they might mean for the future. Stay tuned. Let's talk about Seedstream though quickly. Seedstream is a Formula One app that some friends and I developed over the last couple of years. There's now become my most trusted and preferred app for all of my F1 news content in form of video, audio, written content, social media articles from all across the web, and your trusted journalists from within the sport of Formula One. It's my first place I open, the first app I open in the mornings, the only place I get all of my F1 news and content from. I think you will really enjoy it. It's completely free, so please go check it out. The link will be in the description of this video, or just search Seedstream wherever you get your apps from. Right, the Hungarian Grand Prix. It was an absolute privilege, as it always is, but perhaps even more so this week, for me to be able to commentate on what I thought was a fascinating Grand Prix on so many different levels. I was commentating for the BBC this weekend, as I often do. And of course, the race had its moments. It had a good start where there was a little bit of interesting stuff. Oscar Piastri with his elbows out. Max Verstappen finding a way past Lando Norris. It was a bit of an interesting opening couple of laps. It did settle down, of course, into some of those duller tyre saving, tyre management phases, which we get now in every Grand Prix. But at the end, it came alive. And I don't just mean about what was happening on the racetrack. Of course, I'm referring to the radio messages that we were fortunate enough to have played out across the airways for us all to, I say, enjoy. I think it was a real eye-opening insight into a couple of different people up and down the pit lane, both drivers but also teams as well. An insight into the human element that goes into making up this sport. It's such a technically focused sport, and yet it's easy to sometimes forget there are thousands and thousands of people that make the sport what it is. None of the technical brilliance that happens could happen without the brilliant people making it so. And today we got a little window, a little insight into that human side. Before I get into the details of what happened and what I think it means, let's just say massive congratulations to Oscar Piastri, but actually the entire McLaren organisation. This is a groundbreaking and a massive result for everybody at that team. It's a result that's been coming in recent weeks, but actually for many, many years before that, it seemed like a world away, hasn't it? You don't have to go back very far where you find McLaren at the back of the grid. I mean, literally the slowest team not that long ago. They spent a lot of time in the midfield just dreaming of getting back towards a podium, to have these fights that we keep talking about with other drivers and cars around them. And yet now we've found them with a car that is unequivocally the fastest car on the Formula One grid right now, particularly today in the conditions we had and around this circuit. But actually they're able to fight with pretty much anybody on any given day now. They have made dramatic improvements, and it's testament to an awful lot of hard work that's gone on behind the scenes over a very long period of time. So well done. Congratulations to everyone at McLaren. I am very, very happy for all of you. But let's talk about the closing stages. Now, let's talk about McLaren first of all. Now, McLaren, it's difficult to criticise McLaren too much because they finished the race with a 1-2. I mean, it's literally the best result you can get, and they absolutely nailed it. They dominated this race. No one else was in their league at all in terms of car performance. But in the closing stages, as you will know, with Oscar Piastri leading the Grand Prix, Lando Norris in second place, Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc were some way further back, but they'd made an early pit stop and put some fresh tyres on. And there was a minimal, albeit minimal, there was a risk that they could come into play with their fresh tyres, effectively using an undercut to bring themselves into a fight with Lando Norris. I actually don't think that that was necessarily a very big risk, but nonetheless, you do, when you're in that position, have to protect against it. So I understand from the team's perspective absolutely why they made the call to bring Lando Norris in. Normally in that situation, you would of course give preference to the lead driver, which in that case was Oscar Piastri. In that case, you would give Oscar the early pit stop, or at least the option of the early pit stop, so that there is no chance of him being undercut by his teammate, which of course is exactly what happened. In being forced, and I say forced in inverted commas, in being tempted into make that earlier pit stop with Lando Norris, so bringing him in first out of the two McLarens, yes, he protected against any threat from behind with Lewis Hamilton or Charles Leclerc, but he also got his fresh tyres on earlier than Oscar Piastri and made very good use of them to catapult his way past the other McLaren by the time that Oscar had made his second pit stop. Now, this was always going to be a risk of the strategy that McLaren played, but that was fine because they had a strategy in mind that would sort it all out. If that was indeed what happened, and if there was no threat from behind, which it turned out there wasn't, they could just ask the drivers to switch places back again. Now, if you watch the race, and even if you've seen any of the social media coverage, you will know that that's not necessarily just how it happened, certainly not in that straightforward a manner. And I don't blame Lando Norris, first of all, for feeling pretty disgruntled about the fact that he got himself into the lead, albeit through that undercut on his own teammate. But he then set about putting in a few blisteringly fast laps, which, by the way, Oscar Piastri could not match. Not in a million years. He wasn't even close to matching Lando Norris's pace when he put the hammer down towards the end of the Grand Prix. So when the team asked Lando to give the place back to Oscar, his response was silence on the radio at first, put in a couple of fastest laps to open up the gap, not reduce it, opened up the gap to about 6 seconds, and just waited to see what Oscar could do in response. Now, Oscar had nothing in response, certainly not a match for Lando in that closing phase of the race. The team were then on about trying to persuade Lando to give the place back. And the way that they did that, I do have some criticism around, because they tiptoed around the subject so delicately, seeming like they didn't want to upset anybody, nobody being particularly forceful. I think the opening line was, look, Lando, if you don't mind, when you're ready or at your earliest convenience, if you wouldn't mind giving the place back to Oscar, that would be great. It was something to that effect, something that nice and polite. And of course, it left the door open to Lando to interpret that in that it wasn't necessarily an all-out instruction. There was some freedom within that for him to sort of run his own race and maybe do it later or maybe not, whatever. And over the next few laps, Lando was obviously in his own crash helmet deciding that actually he felt a bit disgruntled here because, yes, he'd found himself in the lead of the race a little bit fortuitously, but now he was the faster of the two McLarens. So why should you give up your race-leading position as the fastest car to a car that's not as quick as you to hand over the race win? That's the Lando Norris perspective here, which I completely understand, by the way. But then if you flip over to the perspective of Oscar Piastri, equally, I can feel why he's so disgruntled as well. He's been sold a sort of bum strategy, if you like, not the way things normally pan out. He was sitting comfortably in the lead with a gap whilst looking after tyres, and he could always argue that, well, if I knew this was going to happen, I'd have pushed even harder to build an even bigger gap. So I wasn't in undercut threat from Lando Norris. That is what he will say. Whether it's true or not, we will never know. But the point was, he thought he was safe. He didn't think he had to protect from a threat from his own teammate behind. And in the end, it was that came. So this radio discussion where Lando was refusing at first to switch the positions back, the team, instead of giving a very clear and direct instruction, still continued to tiptoe around the way they asked him, almost resorting to using emotion to try and tempt him into doing the right thing, using those words. I hope you're going to do the right thing, Lando. Don't forget, you can't go and win championships on your own. Remember what we say in every Sunday morning briefing ahead of the Grand Prix, which is, we will win as one. We move forward together. We cannot win alone. No driver, no member of the team can do anything without everybody else doing their part around them. It's how they start every Sunday morning meeting, and that had to be read out and reminded to Lando Norris over the radio. You can imagine a scenario in Lando's crash helmet where he's mulling this over in his head. They had the luxury of having around 10 or 12 laps still to the end of the race at this point. And Lando started to think about, well, is it the right thing? He's obviously angry because he doesn't want to give up the lead. In his mind, he still feels there's a hope for a championship fight towards the end of the season. So giving up what would be 7 points between first and second place could be quite crucial as the season plays out. And in his own head, he had to almost talk himself round into eventually allowing Oscar to catch up, very deliberately slowing right down on the start-finish straight and letting him pass. And they did have the luxury of no threat behind. Lewis by this point was 12 or 13 seconds back, I think. It was a race of just the two McLarens. They then, of course, saw it out to the end. So my only criticism around the whole McLaren saga was the way that they tiptoed around the subject. And I say criticism in inverted commas because I don't really want to criticise them at all. They got a great result today, and this is uncharted territory for them. This is a new phase of operating in Formula One for most people at McLaren. They've never been in a situation where they are leading Grand Prix, particularly where they've got two drivers fighting for the win. Certainly not when they've been dominating races. This is territory which they will find themselves in more and more often as the weeks, months, and over into next year at least play out. This is something that McLaren will already be starting to get used to. We've seen a couple of decisions on strategy, operationally over the last few weeks and months that maybe have let one or two wins slip through their fingers. And as I said in the commentary today, I'm cool with that. I'm okay with that because that is exactly what happens when a team transitions from a midfield outfit into a sport dominating outfit, which is what McLaren are doing right now. To get from here to here, you have to go through this phase of figuring it out, making a few of these mistakes. They've made some of those mistakes in strategy. We've seen them, we've criticised them, but they probably won't make those same mistakes again. Today, they might have learned some things about how they deal with two drivers fighting on the same bit of racetrack for the win. And that's the big difference. When you're fighting for the win, particularly when you start fighting for championships, it gets nasty if the management don't step in and take control of the situation. And one of the potential consequences of what happened today is you give the drivers a little bit too much of a leash. I don't think it's going to cause any major problems or be a big problem in terms of relationships at McLaren off the back of what happened today. But you just planted a seed in Lando Norris's mind that maybe the team are not necessarily in charge here. Maybe he's been given a little bit too much leash here to make his own mind up on what he wanted to do. Now, I referred back earlier on to back in the days of Ron Dennis, for example. There's no way Ron Dennis would have let that happen. I'm not sure a Toto Wolff would have allowed that to happen. I can see a scenario where Toto would step in and come on the radio and literally bark orders to the two drivers, letting them know who's in charge and making it very, very clear what he expected to happen. Ron Dennis would have done, and definitely has done in the past, the same sort of thing. So maybe that's one of the learnings that comes out of today. But if that's the biggest learning, wonderful, because McLaren are back. They are the quickest team in Formula One right now. They are definitely in with a serious shout. Maybe you could even go as far as to say they might be favourites to take the Constructors' Championship. They moved into second place today and they have the fastest car with two very quick drivers, which Red Bull do not have right now. Which brings us on to Red Bull. Now, whilst all this was playing out at McLaren, down at Red Bull, there were also some angry, furious, emotionally charged radio messages going back and forward between Max Verstappen and GP, Gianpiero Lambiase. Max was a frustrated driver all day today, and this could be a signal or a sign of things to come. Max was frustrated because he wasn't quick enough, because the car wasn't quick enough, because he's now been overtaken in terms of performance, definitely by McLaren, and on other occasions by other teams too. At Silverstone, it was Mercedes who were quicker at times. There have been occasions in different races when it's been Ferrari. We've seen and we know that McLaren have a quicker car in almost all scenarios now. So Max can see himself tumbling down the order. It's not a position he's familiar with and certainly not one he's comfortable with. And that frustration played out today. A lot of moaning and complaining on the radio. That's not unusual for Max when he's not happy, of course. He lets everybody know. And that's okay, by the way, because the team do need that feedback. It can come across as petulant at times, almost like a spoilt kid that's had his toys taken away. I'm not saying that's what Max is, by the way, before everyone jumps on me here. But that could be or could be how it's interpreted. But as the race played out, that frustration grew, and the messages between Max and his engineer became more and more angry, more and more frustrated on both sides, by the way. And the way it played out, I think, has the potential to plant seeds of harm in the relationship not just between Max and GP, because they're quite used to this kind of relationship, and by tomorrow I'm sure they'll be over it, but between Max and his team. At the post-race interviews, Max was talking about, he's being very openly critical about Red Bull's strategy and operations, and by the way, much of that I agreed with. It was a rare occasion when Red Bull got quite a few things wrong. They got their strategy calls wrong. I'm sure they will agree once they've reviewed the race. Being undercut twice by Lewis Hamilton on a circuit where the undercut is powerful. They didn't have the fastest pit stops today. In fact, nobody had particularly fast pit stops today. I think they just got one or two things wrong. They got the setup of the car potentially wrong. The car was very much understeery today. That's a situation that Max really doesn't like to contend with. His tyres were overheating because he found himself in traffic. But ultimately, it's all about the fact that his car hasn't been developed in the same sort of efficient way that the likes of McLaren have. They brought a big update to this racetrack, but it hasn't been bringing them anywhere near enough performance if you compare it to what McLaren have been doing. Max is getting frustrated. And if we extrapolate that out into the bigger picture, yes, the Constructors' Championship is very much in contention. And I would say, as I said a moment ago, you could even argue that McLaren could be favourites over the course of this season with two drivers at the front. Not only does that affect the Constructors' Championship, but in the Drivers' Championship, although it's still maybe a long shot for Lando Norris to mount a real serious challenge, it's not out of the question. And part of the reason for that is Max is fighting on his own. As the season rolls on, McLaren will be able to use both of their drivers in a sort of two-pincer movement against the single car of Verstappen, because Perez is just not able at the moment to fight on the same level. It may well prompt a change at Red Bull in terms of drivers. We'll cover that in another video. But in terms of the relationship, when I was going back to that post-race interview of Max Verstappen being openly critical, he talked about the team using the word they. They left me out too long. They got this wrong. They weren't able to deliver this for me this week. Normally you hear a driver talk about the team as we. We got this wrong today. We made a slight mistake in terms of strategy. We need to develop the car more. It was very much a me and them in the way that he was talking. And I just wonder if that might be a sign of things to come. There's been rumours for some time about Max potentially jumping ship and going to Mercedes, much more likely for 2026. But I just wonder if it could happen earlier than that. If these frustrations boil over, if Red Bull are unable to develop the car in the same way that Max expects it to be delivered, in the same way that other teams around them are doing so, I wonder if he might look elsewhere. And I wonder if Mercedes becomes a more attractive option. A car that is on a development path, quite early in that path, by the way, which means there's a lot of scope to develop that Mercedes car, having unlocked the new ways of working that they have done at the Silver Arrows. And as you look ahead to 2026, when we talk about power unit changes and chassis unit changes, yeah, you could pin your colours to the mast at Red Bull and say, I want to stay there. Developing their own power unit brings a certain level of advantage. However, they are new to that game, and there is some element of risk in doing that. Who knows what they'll be able to deliver? Mercedes would seem like a much surer bet. Somebody who has consistently delivered very strong power units. Don't forget, it's the Mercedes power unit that's not only powering Mercedes, it's the one that won the race today. It's the one that stuck the cars on pole. The one that's consistently beating Max Verstappen is a Mercedes power unit. I wonder if this could be the beginning of a real consideration for Max that he might be better off in terms of fighting for a championship outside of this Red Bull structure moving forward. Speculation, but I just wonder. Anyway, those are the thoughts I had today. I thought Max's collision with Lewis Hamilton, there's been no further action I've just seen from the stewards. And I sort of understand that. At first glance, I thought it's a definite slam dunk penalty for Max. The only circumstances that I can think that might sit in Max's favour, and Max in fact said this himself, as he was in the braking phase, Lewis did move towards the corner, turned in very, very early, moved very early towards the apex, closing down Max, who's braking or trying to brake in a straight line, forcing Max to turn into the corner while still trying to heavily brake. And it was that meant as soon as you turn the steering wheel of a Formula One car whilst on the brakes, you will lock those tyres. You need to do your heavy braking in a straight line so you've got the biggest contact patch in contact with the tarmac to give you most braking force and most grip. The moment you turn the steering wheel, these sort of angles of geometry change in such a way that you end up with a very small contact patch, and instantly you'll lock the tyres. You never brake and turn at the same time if you can possibly avoid it. Lewis forced him into doing that today. He then locked up and sailed on past through the corner and into the collision. So I'm certainly not saying it's Lewis's fault, but I think there's enough of a circumstance to say that both played a part in that collision. And I suspect, I haven't read the full report from the stewards, but I suspect that is the conclusion they came to. Anyway, I thought it was a fascinating, interesting insight into lots of behind the scenes in today's race. As I said, we got to see a bit of the human element. We got to see a little bit of frustration boiling over from Max Verstappen. GP calm as ever in his response in general, but that relationship was at least seemed fractured in the race today. And at McLaren, yeah, I think there's a power struggle, an inadvertent power struggle, which will begin to emerge between Lando, who, if he's got any ambitions of becoming world champion, needs to get his elbows out, needs to get feisty, needs to stamp his mark on the championship, and needs to be selfish. And I did question earlier on if this was Max Verstappen in the position of Lando Norris at the end of that race, being asked to give the position back. I don't see him swapping the places back. I don't see Max doing that. I don't see Sebastian Vettel giving a place back in that kind of scenario either. I'm not sure Fernando Alonso would, certainly not when he's going for a championship. I wonder, and this is a question, you can let me know what you think on this, will Lando Norris reflect on today, either thinking he's done the right thing for the team, or will he reflect and say, if I want to be taken seriously as a championship contender, as a real force in Formula One moving forward, should I have put down a line in the sand today? Should I have stamped my feet and made Oscar Piastri overtake him if he wants to go for the Grand Prix victory? Oscar wasn't able to do that in the end, so should that mean that Lando could feel hard done by that he wasn't able to take another win and the valuable points which could play a role in the title race later on in the season? I'd love to know your thoughts on all of those things. Of course, there was lots more happening in the race today, but there just isn't time to cover all of it. So those are the most interesting topics for me. I'd love to know what you think. Please do go and check out the Seedstream F1 app. It is brilliant. It's free. It's easy to use. It's fun. There's a little predictions league in there as well. If you want to pitch your psychic tendencies against other fans of the sport, including me, I'm in there. Please do go and download it. Get it from the App Store. Just search Seedstream, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to know your thoughts. Leave me your comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, please. And there'll be more content like this coming your way soon. Have a great week.